And it's a huge pleasure to be in what I'm told is the capital of West Flanders. But actually it is a great pleasure for all British people to be in Flanders. Ours is an old and enduring but sometimes neglected alliance. In our long wars, my country's almost interminable series of wars against France, there were Flemish soldiers on the same side as us almost all the way through. From Sluis, the very first of our battles in 1340, until Waterloo in 1815. I think Ghent is where the rebellion against the Count of Flanders began because of the Anglophile population wanting to keep the links between our two countries. And what was the basis? On what did that old friendship rest? On the surest possible foundation, which is trade. In the 13th century, we have an old history by a man called Matthew Paris, contemporary of King John. And there's a lovely sentence in it where he says, "All the world is dressed in the wool of England, spun into cloth by the weavers of Flanders." What more secure foundation for friendship between peoples than free exchange to mutual benefit? So I'm delighted, as your chairman said, delighted to be the chairman of the Alliance of European Conservatives, and as a British Conservative, and as insofar as it has any meaning in my country, as a Flanagan sympathiser, I'm delighted that we have the NBA as our allies alongside us in the European Parliament. They are great patriots for this part of the world, and therefore great Europeans, because they stand for the devolution of power. Well, this is a very dark time of year. The nights are getting longer. Is it getting colder, asks Nietzsche. The lamp's now lit in the morning. I'm going to begin with some suitably dark observations, apt to this season. Incredibly, the Eurozone is teetering on the brink of its third recession in 6 years. The basic economic data are all gloomy. Three biggest countries in the Eurozone by far are France, Germany, and Italy. Among them, they account for 2/3 of the total Eurozone economy. All three of them saw economic contractions in the second quarter of this year. It seems almost certain that all three of them have contracted again in the third quarter. Business confidence is down over the last 12 months in the Eurozone from 35 to 5%. Productivity is down, competitiveness is falling, unemployment has risen. The long-term indicators, if anything, are even more gloomy. To a single approximation, Italy has not experienced any economic growth since the euro was launched. Do you know when the last time that the French state ran a balanced budget was? Any guesses? When was France last in surplus? 1974. You can't carry on forever with that kind of policy. There comes a moment when the money runs out. And we've reached that moment now. Okay, maybe you say France, no big surprise, Italy, no big surprise. Germany is the big surprise. What's been holding the whole Eurozone economy aloft up until now has been the strength of German exports. But in the last quarter, German exports have fallen faster than at any time since before the credit crunch. Partly because of the tit-for-tat sanctions with Russia over Ukraine, partly because of a general failure to have made investments during the time when the artificially cheap exchange rate made it look as though things were okay. In other words, Germany, Atlas-like, which had been bearing aloft the single currency, is now beginning to sweat and sway. This is only happening in our part of the world. It's got past the point where we can blame the credit crunch or the subprime crisis or the banks. Every other continent is recovering. Every other archipelago is recovering. I write a blog on the Daily Telegraph in London. And a few months ago I made a throwaway light-hearted remark. I said, every continent on Earth is experiencing economic growth except Antarctica and Europe. And a Spanish friend of mine got in touch, quite crossly, and he sent me this long list of data to accept as I read through his statistics that I was wrong and he was right. Antarctica is doing fine. And the Antarctican economy is recovering in line with everyone else. This is the only continent in the world that is experiencing economic growth. Why? How come everybody else has shaken off the virus of the credit crash over the past 6 years, but in the case of Europe, it has become one of those chronic conditions that keeps coming? The short answer is, of course, the euro, and more precisely the way in which the governments responded to the euro crisis. Faced with the debt crisis, they decided to borrow, pressing new loans on countries that couldn't afford to pay their existing obligations. Faced with tensions in monetary union, they said, we need more of it. You know, it's not enough. If monetary union didn't work, let's do it even more. Let's have fiscal union, euro bonds, tax harmonisation, pan-European finance ministry. This is the solution of I say your Mr. Verhofstadt. I mean, I hope you don't all regard him as your Mr. Verhofstadt, but let's say of Belgium's Mr. Verhofstadt. I think there is a flawed logic here. To say the monetary union didn't work, it was not possible to apply a single economic policy to countries with widely divergent conditions and needs. Therefore, let's integrate them even more. That's like saying, if you hurt yourself falling out of a first-story window, let's try jumping out of a sixth-story window and seeing if that's any better. The EU has responded to the crisis in monetary union by accelerating the policies that caused it in the first place. They're giving more and more of the medicine that made the patient sick. But I'm not going to say that the problem is entirely about monetary union. Plainly, there was a debt crisis in this part of the world that goes well beyond the Eurozone. My country has it, Hungary has it, Latvia has it. It's not just a Eurozone crisis. There is a much wider and deeper-rooted European malaise. And it comes from this simple fact, this one equation that you can't break. We have been increasing our consumption without commensurate increases in our production. We have been bridging the difference with debt. We've been, in other words, borrowing from what Shakespeare calls your children, yet unborn and unbegot. And there comes a moment when you can't do that anymore. There is no law of nature that says that there are kids in Bangalore making these devices for us so that we can sit around retiring earlier and earlier, leaving university later and later, and spending the short few years in between working for the government. It doesn't work like that. The money eventually is bound to run out. We need to rethink, think of when you were at school, think of when you were doing a geography lesson. On the map, on the wall, there was a map of the world, okay? And the map of the world has Europe in the middle. The map's actually been distorted to put Europe in the middle. The middle isn't actually the equator. But you've got to rethink that. That's not the world that you are growing up into. It's not the world that's happening now. Just as 500 years ago, there's a shift, a slow shift from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic as the new centre of world commerce, so now there is a shift from the Atlantic to the Pacific. My country joined the European Union in 1973. In that year, the share of the world economy accounted for by Western Europe, which I will define for these purposes as the EU as it stood prior to the 2004 enlargement. In other words, the EU before the communist countries joined. Western Europe in 1973 was 36% of the world economy. Today, that figure is 24%. In 2020, it will be 15%. We are falling further and further behind. Now, Why is that? Let's stand back and ask the really global question. This is a long-term decline that predates the euro crisis. It is true that our friends in Brussels have played a hand, which was a difficult hand, spectacularly bad. They have exacerbated their problems. They've made the crisis worse, but the crisis would have been there anyway. What is it that we've got wrong? Maybe the best way of answering it is to look at what we got right. Go back and ask, why did Europe become so prosperous in the first place? Why is it that the last half millennium has been dominated by our civilization and our values? Perhaps there we will find some clue, some key to explaining our present business. Let me ask you all to join me in a little thought experiment. Imagine that you were circling the world in a spaceship. You were a visitor from another planet 500 years ago, staring out of the porthole of your flying saucer, looking at the fragile blue globe, studying its civilizations. I put it to you that your eye would have been drawn to the great monarchies of Asia, to the Mings, the Moguls, the Ottomans. They would have seen the dominant culture on the planet, without question, with their canals and their ocean-going ships, with their paper money and their gunpowder, with their cartography, their mathematics, their geography, their astronomy. Plainly, these were going to be the dominant civilization. You would have barely noticed the broken, scattered tribes at the western tip of the Eurasian landmass. You would have assumed that the Chinese were going to sail around Africa and discover Portugal, rather than the other way around. Now, why didn't that happen? What was the key to the European miracle? Why is it that the last half millennium bears a European imprint? Well, I'm not going to claim that this is an original theory. I'm borrowing from an Australian historian called E.L. Jones. His thesis was taken to a much wider audience by Paul Kennedy in his Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. The secret of Europe's success was precisely that it didn't become a single empire. It remained a diverse plurality of competing states. The Chinese, the Indians, and the Ottomans went down the road to more and more centralization, more and more uniformity, higher and higher taxation. But Europe, broken by its mountains and its rivers into lots of competing different language groups and different states, encouraged a culture of enterprise and adventure, where countries could pilot new schemes, trial new ideas, check out what worked, and copy best practice in their neighbours. Even in the most literal sense, that's when Peter the Great was sending out his agents, saying, find out how the English build their ships, find out how the Dutch make their cannon, bringing back the best of the knowledge that had come through innovation. That was the miracle. That's what allowed, yes, with elements of competition, even with elements of conflict, allowed us, nonetheless, to lift our standard of life, our economic standard, beyond anything that would have been thought possible. Now, I'm sure you can all see where I'm going with this argument. The tragedy of our generation is that just as the great civilizations of Asia have learned the secret of diffusing and decentralizing and devolving power, just as India and China are giving up on the centralized state, allowing enterprise to flourish, the European Union is going in the opposite direction. Committed as it is to ever closer union, insistent on shifting more and more powers from national and provincial level to Brussels. You don't really find any mandarins in China these days. Not anymore. You can find plenty of them where I work. But what was a Mandarin? A Mandarin was somebody who had had to take a complicated exam showing great detailed knowledge of how things were always done in the past. That seems to me a pretty good description of your average European official. It's a culture that is deeply hostile to innovation. A culture which begins from the proposition that it is better to do something badly at EU level than to allow it to happen in different, unregulated ways at a law. Now look, I'm not saying these things as someone who is anti-Europe. I speak French, I speak Spanish, I've lived and worked all over the continent. I have no problem with the idea of an association of neighbouring countries coming together to regulate their disputes, to arbitrate their differences, and to achieve collectively what they can't achieve singly. Right? I hope no one would be against that. You'd have to be insane to find that objectionable. The problem with the European Union is that it has become remote, and cut off, and corrupt, and that it's turned its back on the values that raised Europe in the first place. The diversity, the variety, the pluralism that underpinned our economic success. There's almost no field of policy that doesn't now have some aspect of EU regulation. So, I am, for example, obliged by EU law to drive my children around in car seats until they reach the age of 12 or a certain minimum height, whichever comes first. I had been looking forward to discarding the wretched yogurt-encrusted blobs at a much earlier stage than I can. Speak obviously from the car seats, not of the children. Now, you may agree or you may disagree with me about whether children should have car seats, but my point is, how did that ever become an issue that had to be legislated for more than 500 million people and then imposed uniformly? Where is the international dimension? Isn't this something that we can all work out for ourselves through our own national mechanisms and procedures? And so it goes on. The difficulty you have opening a bank account these days with all these stupid proofs of address and old bills, that is the EU's money laundering directive. The regulations on how to build a house, on how to pass a driving test. These are all issues. I'm not saying that the EU is wrong about them. But I'm just saying, how did we get to the disproportionality where matters of that kind, instead of being determined at local or national level, are imposed on an entire continent? And it's that centralisation, it's that growth of government that explains why this is the world's only shrinking continent. In a normal situation, when you have competing different states, competition is the check on excessive government. A state, a national state, in free competition with its neighbours, can raise its taxes up to a certain point. Then people start fleeing to friendlier tax jurisdictions. I lived for 4 years in Brussels, in a nice part of Excel, and suddenly, when Hollande was elected, my street filled up with French people. And in fact, there were very few Belgians in that street in the first place, but there was one old lady who was kind of doyenne of the street, and she said, "Monsieur, you're a politician. Explain something to me. What kind of country are they fleeing that they see Belgium as a paradis fiscal?" There are better qualified people than me to answer that question. But the thing that stops a government, as it has stopped Hollande, is precisely international competition. Massive wealth taxes do not redistribute wealth, they redistribute people. And eventually, the government has to, as he is now having to, change direction in order to maintain some kind of fiscal base. And it's the same thing when it comes to social and employment rights. You can give your workers the most generous entitlements, paternity leave and paid holidays, up to a certain point. Then the factories begin to relocate, the jobs go abroad. And so the constraint on big government is international competition. Now the problem with the European Union is that it sets out to undo that competition. It sets out to harmonise, to regulate, to prevent what is called harmful tax competition or social dumping by having common standards. Jean-Claude Juncker, in his speech accepting the Parliament's nomination to the Commission presidency, said we need to have a pan-European minimum wage. Well, if there was nowhere else in the world except the European Union, you could understand the logic. I would still be against it. It seems to me that if I want to work for you and if you want to employ me and if we're both happy with the terms and conditions, it is wrong for a government to declare our contract illegal. But you can at least understand if there were no foreign competition. Maybe back in the 50s, when the patriarchs of Europe were putting their schemes together, when the competition came from Greece or Spain, it kind of made sense. But today, when the competition is coming from India, Brazil, and Indonesia, you just ensure that you fall further and further behind. That wealth, power, and influence drain away from Europe and go to other parts of the world. I want to really leave time for questions and for discussion. So let me finish as I began. I began by citing the long, friendly relations between my country and Flanders. And I'll finish with them because, of course, today, of all days, we remember the liberation of Belgium and the end of the most horrible war in European history. A war in which most British people, including me, lost family, and I suspect people in this room also did. So, a war that elevated and ennobled everyone who fought in it, whatever side they were on. Ordinary people did the most extraordinary things. But I think we make a mistake if we simply remember the Great War as a kind of symbol of futility, as if it had no cause at all, as though it were only about the waste of lives. There was, after all, a geopolitical cause. Europe went to war as a series of multinational empires, and after 1918, the conditions of free democracies were made possible because Europe was divided into a number of competing states. It had returned, if you like, to its natural condition of being a series of different territories rather than one centralized one. I'm going to read something written by the great 18th century English historian Edward Gibbon. He wrote this monumental decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And early in it, in the introduction, he talks about the consequence of the post-Roman period. He says, the division of Europe into a number of independent states, connected however with each other by the general resemblance of religion, language and manners, is productive of the most beneficial consequences to the liberty of Europe. A modern tyrant, who should find no resistance either in his own breast or in his people, would soon experience a gentle restraint from the example of his equals, the dread of present censure, the advice of his allies, and the apprehension of his enemies. In other words, the strongest constraint, not just on economic aggrandizement, but also on totalitarianism, is having competition, having other jurisdictions out there to do better than you. Gibbon was writing at a time when we were experiencing a huge influx of French refugees into the English-speaking world. Following the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, he could see the impact. Probably tipped the balance in those Anglo-French wars which I was talking about earlier, but you guys can't answer. The energy and enterprise of the Huguenots who landed in the UK were a huge boost, just as the energy and enterprise of the 500,000 French people who have come fleeing Hollande's taxes and have settled in London is a huge boost to our economy. But it happens because you have competing jurisdictions. It can't happen if you have a European superstate. So let me end with a plea as a European to fellow Europeans, and let me quote that great liberal German economist Wilhelm Röpke, one of the first of his countrymen to see through and decry the Nazi madness, and one of the first people to see where the European project might end up. Writing in 1956, he said, In antiquity, Strabo spoke of the many shapes of Europe. Montesquieu wrote of Europe as a nation des nations. Decentralization is of the essence of the spirit of Europe. To try to organize Europe centrally and to weld it into a bloc is nothing less than a betrayal of Europe and of Europe's patrimony, a betrayal made all the worse for being carried out in Europe's name. So I will just go ahead and take questions. That's right.
Yes. Any questions for Mr. Hannan?
Yes, please.
Yeah, as I understand it, you see competition as a great positive factor for Europe's success historically, like Ferguson or, for example, the in the Netherlands. But isn't it so that Germany, before its unification, was actually a collection of semi-successful to failed states, with the exception of Prussia, of course, and until after its unification, it was a power-wielding great power with influence throughout the world. So couldn't you say that sometimes unification can be a good thing?
Yes, when it happens within a nation, as in that case. When you have a unit where there is a similarity of language and culture and a compatibility of identity, then yes, it's a very good thing. And the critical difference between German unification, Italian unification, and what we're doing now, European unification, is that you have that sense of a common first person plural. Okay. It's an almost miraculous thing in a functioning nation state that we are prepared to tolerate government from people that we might intensely dislike simply because they won an election. So it's a highly unusual thing in the world. There are not many places where it happens. You look at almost any conflict zone, Ukraine, Syria, it's usually because people do not feel that identity. They don't feel that they have enough in common one with another to accept government from each other. Now, within the German-speaking territories, plainly it was possible to put such a sense together. People felt a community of, an affinity of culture and of common Germans. And I think, we have that in the UK. You have it in Sweden or in Portugal or in Hungary. People watch the same TV, they speak the same language, they sing the same songs. They have that basic connection. I'm not sure we do have it in the European Union. We are a wide diversity of different countries with non-cognate languages, with different traditions, with different religions. Speaking as a British person, I think this is true of 90% of my countrymen. We feel more connection, as you would expect, to other common law English-speaking countries than we do to our immediate geographical neighbours. Where do our Christmas cards go at Christmas? Where do our telephone calls go? North America, the Caribbean, India, Australia, New Zealand, exactly what you would expect. Countries where the parliaments look like ours, where the history is shared, where the head of state is the same in many cases. It's exactly what you would expect to happen. Even then, there wasn't enough connection to keep it in a single political system. There was a largely peaceful separation of powers. Find me an example of a really successful multinational state.
The Roman Empire?
Well, you know what? They work until they become democratic. They work until people are given the choice. So perhaps we're given by the Ottomans, the Romanovs, anyway, right? They work as police states. The moment that people get the vote, they fall apart. You can have, what Charles de Gaulle said when he made his broadcast in 1941. He said, democracy and national sovereignty are the same thing. Democracy and national sovereignty are the same thing. Think about it. In order to make the system work, you need to feel enough patriotism that you will pay taxes to support strangers. Enough patriotism that you will obey laws even when you think that they are bad laws. Enough patriotism that you will accept election results even when you voted for the losing party. Now, whether the whole of Belgium has those things, I don't know. You guys are going to decide that. I'm always and everywhere in favour of referendums on these issues. But if you are struggling even in this damp green, exquisite corner of Europe, united for hundreds of years, to have a consensus about a common identity. What possible chance of creating such an identity from Finland to Portugal to Greece? Yeah?
And what's about Switzerland?
Well, I think Switzerland has a very strong sense, a very clear sense of national identity, and the proof of that is that there have been 3 monstrous wars between France and Germany since 1870. And on none of those occasions was there the slightest tension between French and German-speaking Swiss, because long before then, they had formed a sense of common Swiss nationality that bound them together in a way that it didn't connect them to the neighbouring countries that spoke the same languages. It is possible. You could say maybe we'd get there one day with Europe. Okay? Maybe it's conceivable that if we worked at it long enough and made enough effort politically and educationally, we could create a sense of European identity. Well, I'm not sure. Maybe. I mean, I don't know. But it's not as easy as that. You know, the much more totalitarian states than ours have tried. The Soviet Union spent 70 years trying to create a sense of Soviet nationality, that whether you were from, you know, Estonia or Kazakhstan, you would have your holidays on the Black Sea and you'd all be able to speak Russian and so on. As soon as people got the land, as soon as they were free, they chose independence. But even if it could be made to work, where's the payoff? Say that 100 years from now, 200 years from now, we've created a sense of common European nationality. As I say, it just would leave us a more centralised state, and a less competitive, and therefore a problem. So,
we vote, parliamentarians, they make laws, and our judges make judgments, as it is done in legal states, in democratic states, and then comes the European Court for Human Rights, and they overrule all that, and they wipe away all of the rule of law, all of democracy on national level. That's even far more dangerous than the economic centralization you talked about.
Yes, and well, I'm an opponent of the way the 2 European courts work, partly because neither of them is a court as we would understand it. Most of the only qualification you need to serve as a judge on either the European Court of Justice or the European Court of Human Rights is a law degree. You don't need to have spent a single day on the bench in your home country. So in the ECHR in particular, a lot of the judges are human rights activists, politicians, lawyers, law professors with political agendas, and the same with the ECJ. I think the Belgian nominee, if I've got you guys will correct me if I've got this wrong, but on the ECJ for a long time, the Belgian guy was the justice minister who had released Marc Dutroux. He was, and this was the way of getting him out of. Is that right? Yeah. So it isn't a functioning judicial system as we would expect at national level. You could say that would change if we had a proper European sense of nationality, then maybe people would take it more seriously and so on. We've already tried that. We had the final turnout figures from the last European Parliament elections in July. It took a while to get more processed. And sure enough, it was yet another decline. So turnout has fallen without a break since 1979. Turnout in 1979, I think, was 62%, something like that, across the whole of the EU. You had compulsory voting here, and in some other countries there was a number of places where they held the local elections on the same day. Turnout was still fairly disappointing, 62%. It fell in 1984, it fell again in 1989, fell again in 1994, unbroken decline. 1999, the year that I got in, turnout in the UK was 24%. 24%. More people voted the following day in the eviction round of our version of Big Brother than participated in the election that returned me to the European Parliament. So I thought it can't go any lower than this, but it reached another record low in 2004, then it fell even lower in 2009, and now in 2014, another record. So over a period of 30 years, during which EU institutions have been getting more and more power, participation rate, which is the strongest empirical measure we have, has collapsed. That tells me that you cannot create European nationhood simply by creating European statehood. You can't change national identity with a stroke of a pen, with bureaucratic fiat. National identity depends on a number of things. Some of them are irrational things, but that doesn't make them false. They may be emotional, they may be difficult to define, but don't imagine that they don't exist. And it's this basic misunderstanding in Brussels. I mean, you are all very sophisticated people. You're all listening to me in a foreign language, you know, and you're all following the vast majority of people in Europe don't really move very much. The vast majority of people are monocultures. And the idea that you can just change how they think of themselves because of an EU directive is the strangest conceit, even by the standards of our masters in Brussels. And if you have no democracy, then no, you have no functioning legal system. All right. Yeah.
Do you think something has changed in Brussels since the last elections? Or is it still business as usual? And how do you see it evolve in the next 5 years?
Definitely there is some opposition, in a way that there hasn't been in the European Union. So the three big winners of May's European election were the extreme left, the Le Pen faction. I won't call them extreme right because they might as easily be called extreme left. They are socialist parties with a nationalist agenda. And our group, the conservative group, the free market, moderate Euro-realists. Of course, this has had the effect of pushing all the federalist parties even closer together. So they still have actually a majority. But I wonder whether they have a majority in the nation states now. I mean, I can remember the rhetoric when I was first elected 15 years ago. I would not have imagined the kind of conversations that you get at political and at popular level across Europe now. I spent the recent European election campaigning on behalf of friendly parties in Scandinavia, in Central Europe. The conversations that I was having at meetings like this were really no different from the conversations I have in my own constituency. At some point in the last 10 years, I think it may have come in the aftermath of the French and Dutch referendums, it became a very mainstream thing to think that Brussels had too much power and that some powers should be returned to national or regional level. I think that's now a mainstream position in most European countries, if the opinion polls are to be believed. The only place where it has almost no popular support is in the EU institutions. I wonder, you know, we're remembering so many anniversaries at the moment. It was the anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall yesterday, the day before. And I was 18 when that happened. I'd been travelling a little bit in what we still called Eastern Europe as a teenager. And I can remember thinking that the system can't last because nobody believes in it. I mean, nobody believes in it. Even the officials running these countries no longer believe, if ever they did, in the principles of Marxism-Leninism. And yet, I couldn't see, no one could see how it was going to end. We knew that it couldn't last, and paradoxically, we couldn't see the mechanism that would finish it. And some people, very, very few people, saw the fall of the Berlin Wall come. Some people said, oh, maybe over the next 30 years there'll be a gradual evolution towards a more democratic kind of socialism. A few said there'll be a huge shock, like a Chernobyl type thing that will blow the system apart. What was the event that brought down the Berlin Wall, ultimately? It was the smallest thing, it was the smallest thing, it was the decision of the Hungarian authorities to stop requiring exit visas from East Germans wanting to visit Austria. within a week, the system was unraveled. Okay. Now, obviously, I'm not for a moment suggesting that the EU is like the Soviet Union or that it's obviously it is a union of democracies. The parallel is simply this one. The people at the top, as the old nomenclature, have lost public support, and they know it. They learnt it very brutally in 2005 when the French and Dutch rejected the European Constitution. They're repeating the official slogans, just like the apparatchiks used to do, because they don't know what else to do. And just like in the 1980s, I look at it and I think, this cannot last. But I can't tell you now, any more than I could have told you then, what the mechanism will be, but something will reverse the flow of powers to Brussels. I don't know, maybe a UK referendum, maybe something completely, I don't know. But I know that they've lost public sympathy. Yeah. Sorry. Okay. Yes, please.
How is a liberal faction like the ALDE party, how is it compatible with Eurofederalism that, like you said, propagates?
What a brilliant question. What a brilliant question. I mean, I ask my friends in ALDE this all the time, and they have no answer beyond saying, well, we were there before he was. Well, okay, sure, some of them were there before he was. But if liberalism means anything, it means freedom from state coercion. It means maximum individual autonomy. And yet, when it comes, and in fairness, when I suspect in a national context that Guy Verhofstadt probably is more or less a liberal in that sense, but like our liberals, as soon as he gets to Brussels, it all goes out the window. Anything that comes made in Brussels is good. And it's hard to know whether it's conviction, whether it's habit, or whether it's just that he's doing very well at it now. He's got a comfortable position. I don't know what his motive is, but the good news is more and more members of ALDE are coming over to the ECR group. And he was pretty confident that he was going to have 4 Belgian members, which of course he didn't get. But we had a Slovakian member joined us just the other day, and I have my eye on 1 or 2 others. But we Conservatives overtook ALDE at the last election, and we're continuing to outhold them. Because actually, we are liberals. We're a liberal conservative group. We believe in conservative values, but we also believe in freedom, in free nations, free peoples, and free markets. ALDE doesn't believe in any of those things, which is why they're in the trouble they're in. Yes, sir.
Concerning the recent festivities about the Euro rebate, Mr. Cameron so vigorously negotiated.
Yeah.
Even an infant can see that it was a scam.
Yes.
Don't you fear that Mr. Farage will slaughter the Conservatives in the next elections?
Well, he won't slaughter them, either literally or more vigorously. But you're right, you're absolutely right about it's the insult to our intelligence. It almost is as bad as the injury of the extra money. And it is an injury. I mean, we're having an extra charge levied on us effectively because we didn't join the euro and therefore recover, which is kind of annoying. But then to say, I have halved the bill simply because he's counting it with the rebate rather than without the rebate. The rebate was going to be there anyway. I mean, I was on the main Sunday news program the day before yesterday, and the first question was, so has he halved the bill? And I said, well, you know what? Yesterday I went to a shop in my constituency, and I bought a teapot for £10. British people like teapots, you probably noticed. Tea is a big thing for us. So I bought a teapot for £10. I handed over a £20 note, and I got a £10 note in change. So I could say that I'd halved the bill. It's exactly the same logic. When you say something like that as a politician, it's not just that people don't believe you, it's that they then don't believe the next thing you say, even if the next thing you say was true, because you've lost your credibility. In fact, the problem with the teapot metaphor is only this. My teapot which I'm going to give as a present to somebody, I hope will be of some value. Whereas, of course, we're paying into this EU budget for the privilege of belonging to the world's only shrinking trade bloc. So I'm not sure the teapot was the best analogy in that sense. Yeah. Are we going to lose ground to the UK Independence Party? I think UKIP will struggle to get into double figures as far as seats goes, but they will probably get enough votes to prevent us from forming the majority. This is the drawback of our first past the post voting system. It brutally punishes a division on one side of the political spectrum. If you have two right-of-centre parties, which are more or less Euro-critical, and more or less for secure borders and so on, competing for a similar share of the electorate, in every constituency, although they both might get a respectable share of the vote, they risk letting in somebody else who might not. So we had a by-election in my region not long ago in a town called Eastleigh, just outside Southampton. The Conservative and the UKIP candidates were almost indistinguishable. They were standing on exactly the same platform: secure borders, leaving the EU, lower taxes, etc. And between them, they got 53% of the vote, and they both lost. And the Liberal won the seat with 32% of the vote. If you believe today's opinion polls, and of course opinion polls are only opinion polls, but if people voted in the way that they currently say they would vote, the Conservative and UKIP votes between them would be half the total. But Ed Miliband would become Prime Minister with 34%. That's what happens in a first past the post system when you have two parties splitting the vote on one side of the spectrum. So, logically, we should have reached some kind of coalition. We should have done some kind of deal. Had we done so, we wouldn't be in this mess. And we have the prospect of a centre-right anti-federalist government. But politics isn't always about logic. We're not all androids, we're not all Vulcans. Human emotions come into it, and rivalries, and animosities. And sadly, these animosities look like putting Ed Miliband in office, and I think that reflects badly on all of the people concerned. Right at the back, yes, Peter.
It has always been claimed that the tandem Germany-France was the motor of the EU for a long period. Basically, I do not believe so. I think that the German, or the fact that Germany didn't act, didn't feel, didn't think anymore as a nation state for obvious reasons, etc., simply allowed France to pull the motor of the EU.
You know, it's kind of a contracting out thing of the sort which, when it comes to economics, we free marketeers approve. It's the idea of specialization, comparative advantage. Germany, for all the reasons that you touched on, contracted out its diplomatic policy and its foreign policy to France. And France, in exchange, contracted out its economic policy to Germany. That, in a way, was the essence of the tandem. Germany ran the economics, France got to define the external nature of the Union. It's worth saying, I completely share your analysis, but it's worth saying that the reasons why the European project is beyond argument in Germany are perfectly honourable and understandable ones, although I believe them to be false. I do not believe that jamming different countries together into the same state makes them more peaceful. I just don't believe that. If you look at most of the conflicts in the world today, imagine a map of the world and look at where the conflict areas are, it's usually about disputed nationality. It's usually about a people feeling that they are in the wrong country. Either they want to break away from a country, or they are irredenti who have been left outside the country that they really wanted to be part of. Look at almost anywhere. You know, Kashmir, Chechnya, Kurdistan, any of these places. It's usually about disputed nationality. So jamming everybody together, I think, does not make us get on better. But I don't dispute for a moment the sincerity of my German colleagues who think otherwise. And I'll pass on, if I may, a conversation that I had with a German MEP, who's a good friend of mine. And she's, I guess, in her early to mid-60s. And she said, imagine that you had been in Berlin in 1945. Ruins of the city all around. Your country is bombed and hungry and dishonored and occupied and partitioned. And imagine that some candidate for office had clambered onto the rubble by the ruins of the old Reichstag building and had said, 15 years from now, all of this will be gone. We won't just be rich again, we will be the biggest economy in Europe. And nobody is going to have a problem with it because they will see us as being, in some sense, their country too. She said, you would have regarded that candidate as a lunatic. You'd have shouted, you'd have thrown things at him. She said, to my generation, which is of course Mrs. Merkel's generation, my generation, Europe was the magic wand that made it happen. And therefore, it is beyond argument, literally beyond argument. When Angela Merkel was looking for the money for the bailouts, she stood before the Bundestag and she said, this is a question of peace or war. Well, if you really believed that, of course you would, you know, what, peace is beyond price, right? Of course you would vote for it. But although I say I accept their sincerity, I fundamentally dispute the history. I don't believe that the European Union is a cause of peace in Europe. I believe the European Union is a consequence of a peace in Europe that was based on the defeat of fascism, the spread of liberal democracy, the NATO alliance, and, for that matter, the establishment of the nation state, the end of one country in Europe ruling another. And when you've looked at where have the conflicts been in Europe, former Yugoslavia, Ukraine now, again, it's almost always over a failure of the failure to apply the national principle. You can have peaceful disputes over nationality, of course you can, right? You've been having one in this country, insofar as I understand it, for about 100 years. We just had one in the UK. It was inconceivable that anyone would have fired a shot in anger, one way or the other, over the question of whether Scotland should be in the rest of the Union. But by and large, the general rule is that if you want a peaceful Europe, it is better to have countries living together as good neighbours than being forced together as reluctant tenants. Time for a couple more. Yeah?
Why do you think that national politicians are so eager to hand over their power to the European Union?
That is the 64 million euro question. I honestly struggle with this. It's really, I mean, some of them are fanatic believers in it, of the Verhofstadt kind, okay? But why do so many national parliamentarians disempower their own congresses? It is a very, very strange thing. Part of it is fashion. You know, I've noticed something when I talk to real passionate Euro-integrationists. They rarely talk about the costs or benefits. It's much more for them a kind of Kulturkampf. Do I want to think of myself as a broad-minded, cosmopolitan, tolerant man? Or do I want to think of myself as a football hooligan or as some kind of far-right bigot? Once you have defined the argument in your own mind in those terms, you become remarkably uninterested in the facts and figures. The fact, for example, that it may have been a mistake to launch the euro in the way we did with all of the member countries at the outset that we had. It was an extraordinary, think about that, extraordinary suspension of disbelief, wasn't it, at the end of the 1990s? That in every newspaper editorial conference, every TV station, every economics faculty in every university, every government, every central bank, they all thought, this is going to be fine. It's going to, in fact, not just fine, it's going to be wonderful. It's going to raise the promise that the Commission gave was it will add 1% growth to the GDP of every participating member state in perpetuity. Now, how did they all make that mistake? It wasn't as though was pointing out the flaws. There were plenty of us. It was my first election campaign. I can remember I was very active on that question. There were plenty of people precisely predicting why it would go wrong in the way that it has. And the answer was, when you spoke to these guys in debates, they weren't really interested in the euro. They were interested in showing what cosmopolitan, internationalist, broad-minded people they were. Which, of course, is a very dangerous thing in politics. It means that people have lost touch with the facts. I think that's part of it. And I'll tell you the last reason why politics go wrong. And this may sound vulgar and unpleasant thing to say, but it's true. I've observed it too often. It brings great personal advantages to some of them. It is the perfect post-national career. You know, not necessarily to become a commissioner, but there are so many well-paid and tax-free sinecures in the various European bureaucracies. As an otherwise unemployable national politician, it's hugely attractive. How many of them have gone on? The classic thing was in this, just now appointing the current commission, the outgoing Prime Minister of Slovenia. There were a few days between losing the election and having to stay, and she used that time to promote herself as the Slovenian commissioner. But all that really was an extreme form of what you see on a much lower level. Now, as I say, I'm sorry if this sounds a brutal thing to say, but I've watched it happen with colleagues in the European Parliament. You know, they arrive open-minded on the question of where the balance of power between Brussels and the nation states should be. And then as their lips begin to become champed around the teat of the expensive system, they start to see more and more advantages in it. I remember being in Malta when they had their referendum on whether to join in 2004. All of the quangos were in favour. All of the big agencies and trade associations, because they always are. In Britain as well, the CBI and what they like. Only exception was the Association of Small Businesses. They perfectly reasonably said, hang on, from our point of view, this is all a disaster because we have all the compliance costs of EU regulation, but you know, we're news agents and so on, we're not going to be selling into the single market, so this is all a one-way cost for us. At the last minute, they changed. Nobody could understand why. The chairman suddenly said, we've revised our position, we have to operate within the wider Maltese economy. All of his board was saying, hang on, we haven't discussed this, what do you mean we've changed? A year after that, I saw this chairman as a newly elected Maltese MEP, in which role he was earning about 6 times as Prime Minister. So I'm sorry to be vulgar about it, but I think there is a straightforward pull in that sense. And you only have to reward one guy for the other 10 to think that it might be them next. And I'm afraid that works for diplomats, top civil servants, top politicians, and leaders of these various trade and professional bodies. I can see 2 more hands. Is there anyone else? I can see 1, 2, 3. I'll take those 3 if I may, and then we'll call it a night. Yeah.
So if we take a small look at our history, we've seen that since 1945, and since the dawn of the Cold War, Europe has been more and more relying on America's military strength to safeguard its interests and safety. Meanwhile, European states have been slashing their military budgets under this umbrella of American safety, and even Great Britain has done so. Now that the world is changing and America is trying to, or beginning to show signs of less interventionism, partly due to its more heightened energy sovereignty, shouldn't it be clear that Europe has to reply appropriately and, for example, in the form of a European military that's big enough to withstand these newly challenges of the world?
Okay, I'm going to take the 3 questions, if I may, all together. Yeah.
Happen for us if the European Union integration accelerate, or will there be some kind of backlash?
Good question. Okay, and last one, yes.
I have 2 questions actually. One is why the Tories and not the UKIP? And the second one is you're talking really bad about the European Union, but what are the good things about the European Union? Which laws should be decided at that level and which on a national level?
Okay. I'll take those in reverse order, actually, if I may. So, what are the good things about the European Union? Well, there is one outstandingly good thing, which is that it is always better to be talking regularly to other countries than allowing smouldering grievances. Okay, so today, as any other day, in Brussels, there will be 28 ministers representing 28 nations talking about transport or agriculture or whoever it is today, right? And it doesn't even make a press release now. That's such a standard thing that it doesn't make any news. Go back 200 years and this would have been unprecedented. This was kind of Congress of Vienna. This would have been something that, you know, required months of preparation and would determine borders for decades to come and so on. So it's a really good thing that we're talking to our neighbours. Of course, it doesn't follow from that we need the common agricultural policy, the common fisheries policy, the rules on small business, the justice and home affairs stuff and so on. So what would I like to keep? I would like to keep a European Union that concerns itself only with international questions. In other words, that stops at national borders, doesn't tell a country what to do unless there is an immediate impact from that country's policy on an international level. So, tariff reduction, fine, good idea. Happy to have that. Cross-border environmental pollution, great. Maybe some elements of aviation broadcasting, fine, no problem. But this range of telling us what hours we're allowed to work, whom we're allowed to employ on what terms, what we can plant in the ground, what we can fish from the sea, how loud the music can be in our workplace, how to hold a ladder against the wall. That's a real one, I'm not making that up. On the approved way of holding a ladder against the wall. That is plainly a body that has lost any sense of proportion and has become an end in itself, finding jobs to keep justifying the employment of its own employees. Why Tory, not UKIP? Well, you have heard me say a moment ago, I think that there should have been, and I still think there will need to be, some eventual coming together. That there isn't space in a first past the post system for two competing right and centre Euro-realist parties. It doesn't work like that. The same thing happened in Canada. Two right-wing parties in the early 90s put the Liberals in power there with tiny vote shares by the end for more than a decade, before they finally got together. But the good news is, when they did get together, they were unbeatable. They've increased their vote at every election since. The current government of Canada's Conservative Party is the result of that merger. And eventually such a thing will have to happen in the UK, otherwise we'll never be in office again. There is no chance of a UKIP government in the next election. There is a chance of a Conservative-led government. And that's our best chance of getting a referendum. So that's the short answer why I'm Conservative rather than UKIP. Let's take that further to answer the question here. What would happen if that referendum happens and if the UK votes to leave? Well, that's a really interesting question. And if I knew with certainty, if I could predict the future, well, I'd be a millionaire. I wouldn't be talking to you guys. I'd be sitting in my mansion somewhere, having predicted everything with 100% accuracy. But I'll give you my best guess. Whether we leave through a renegotiation, whether we leave through a referendum, or whether we renegotiate, the end destination, eventually for Britain, is going to be a free trade rather than a political union type relationship. We can get there from the inside, or we can get there from the outside. It becomes almost a technical question, actually, how we get there. But the ultimate position that I think 80% of British people would go for is something along the lines of what the Swiss have. Free movement of goods and services, capital and elements of labour, but on the basis of the primacy of your own law on your own territory. By the way, I can't help noticing that the Swiss are managing somehow. They're scraping some miserable existence out there with the highest standard of living, despite not being. So it is possible. If in getting that kind of status, I would guess, actually I would more than guess, I've spoken to a lot of people from these countries, that the other EFTA countries would probably bring their arrangements into line with ours. And so instead of each having their own bilateral deal with the EU, they would try and create a kind of European Free Trade Association bloc. And my guess is also that some of the other member states might follow. Maybe Denmark, maybe Sweden, maybe Ireland, some of the other more Atlantic, more peripheral, more free trading countries. I would guess would follow. So it's possible then to envisage a pan-continental market with, maybe 40, 45 members from Iceland and the Faroe Islands through to Turkey and Armenia. Loose but effective regulation along the lines of NAFTA or ASEAN. And then within that, a much smaller group of federal countries with their own currency, their own parliament, their own president and police force and army and all the other things they want. Potentially that would leave everybody happy. Would Flanders want to be in the inner or the outer group? I don't know. I mean, I know what Mr. Verhofstadt would want. I don't know what you guys would choose. Some of the countries, I guess, would be catalyzed into loosening their links. Some would be catalyzed into going ahead. I can guess which side the other Belgium would be on, but you guys, I don't know. And then, on the question of the military, which is a good question. I mean, the assumption you make is that big blocs are more effective. And that is sometimes true, but it's not always true. The big pan-European defence procurement project of the last generation has been the Typhoon, the Eurofighter. It was the most spectacularly inefficient, useless, over-budget, and in practical terms, defunct aircraft by the time it began. Britain bought an enormous number of them. No one else will buy them except when bribed. I mean, no third country outside Europe wants to pay for it. What kind of aircraft do we need? One with long loiter time, with buddy refueling, one that can operate from rough local airfields. What have we got? We've got something designed to dogfight Russian rigs over West Germany. 5 times over budget. And why was it so bad? A whole bunch of reasons. Defence procurement projects are often hopeless. But one of the reasons was this ludicrous thing that the Spanish have to build one wing and the Italians have to build the other wing, and all of the politics that came into it. So, insofar as you can find savings, very often they are in inverse proportion to the number of countries you get involved in. If you just wanted to get the most effective armed forces, you would buy off the shelf from the US, which has a huge defence capacity. You would buy some specialist things from Israel or from us or from Europe, but you wouldn't be creating, with a bunch of politicians, a sort of a dromedary of a defence procurement project. And this leads me, and I'll finish with this point, this leads me into to extrapolate a little bit beyond defence. Let's call it the biggest beautiful myth. I think this is what so much of the European ideology is falsely based on. This idea that, the world is dividing into blocks, and we've got China and India and Brazil and so on. We need to be big to be united. If size were a guarantor of prosperity, then China would be wealthier than Hong Kong. And Indonesia would be wealthier than Singapore. And the EU, for that matter, would be wealthier than Switzerland. In fact, what counts is getting the policies right. And to the extent that size comes into it, it is easier to get the policies right in a small country. The richest people in the world are generally found in microstates, in the UAE, the Channel Islands, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and so on. The only big country that gets into the top 10 is the US, because it governs itself like a confederation of small countries. It devolves immense powers to its state and county authority, which I'm hugely in favour of. But sadly, the EU is going in the opposite direction. Whereas the US was founded on the Jeffersonian principle of taking decisions as closely as possible to the people that they affect, line one of the Treaty of Rome commits us to establish an ever closer union. And that's the basic foundational error. It's all about centralizing power. I'll finish with a little conservative observation made by Aristotle. I like to think sometimes that he was the first who said, to the size of a state, there is a limit, just as there is to plants, animals, and implements, for they can none of them retain their natural facility when they're too large. It's true. You know it in a Belgian context, we know it in Europe.